The Devil Amongst the Lawyers. In 1935, when Irma Morton, a beautiful young woman with a teaching degree, is charged with the murder of her father in a remote Virginia mountain community, the case becomes a cause célèbre for the national press. Eager for a case to replace the Lindbergh trial in the public's imagination, the journalists descend on the mountain county, intent on infusing their stories with quaint local color: horse-drawn buggies, run-down shacks, children in threadbare clothes. They need tales of rural poverty to give their Depression-era readers people to feel superior to. The untruth of these cultural stereotypes did not deter the big city reporters, but a local journalist, Carl Jennings, fresh out of college and covering his first major story, reports what he sees: an ordinary town and a defendant who is probably guilty. This journey to a distant time and place summons up ghosts from the reporter's past. Henry Jernigan's sojourn in Japan that ended in tragedy, Shade Baker's hard-scrabble childhood on the Iowa prairie, and Rose Hanlon's brittle sophistication, a shield for her hopeless love affair. While they spin their manufactured tales of squalor, Carl tries to discover the truth in the Morton trial with the help of his young cousin Nora, who has the sight. But who will believe a local cub reporter whose stories contradict the nation's star journalists? For the reader, the novel resonates with the present. An economic depression, a deadly flu epidemic, a world contending with the rise of political fanatics, and a media culture determined to turn news stories into soap operas for the diversion of the masses. The Devil Amongst the Lawyers is an American variation of an Irish fiddle tune that is more commonly known as The Devil's Dream, and sometimes in Scotland as The Deil or Devil Amongst the Tailors. I chose it as the title of the novel because, in my book, the devil amongst the lawyers are the journalists who decide to manufacture their own brand of truth to sell newspapers. The centerpiece of my novel, The Devil Amongst the Lawyers, is the trial of Irma Morton, a young school teacher in far southwest Virginia's Wise County. In this scene, we meet her for the first time in her jail cell in Wise County. Irma. Really, if they left you in a jail cell long enough, you would read anything. She had been given a Bible, of course, several, in fact. Nearly all her early visitors had brought her one, perhaps as a gesture of comfort, or as a reproach for the sins they may have thought she committed. She thanked each person graciously and stowed the Bibles away in a box in the corner of her cell, unread. She wished they'd let her have a radio. One of the first things she had bought last fall with a paycheck from the new job was a fancy floor model radio. It sat in the parlor of her parents' home, but still it was hers. She wondered if she'd ever get to listen to it again. Her cell in the basement of the courthouse wasn't exactly quiet, what with drunks singing and bawling, and prisoners shouting out to the turnkeys for every little thing. But perhaps if they would let her have a radio, she could drown out the cacophony. The latest songs would cheer her up. She had loved the parties they used to have at somebody's home on a Saturday night. A whole gang of young people would show up, roll back the rugs, and dance. No harm in that, whatever people might say now. She'd never be allowed to have a radio. The jailer was her own uncle, and you'd think with that kind of inside track she'd be treated like a princess, but that was not the case. Her uncle was so afraid of being accused of showing favoritism that he erred in quite the opposite direction. He was mortified that his own niece should have got herself arrested, and perhaps he meant to punish her for that humiliation. She wondered if she ought to apologize to him for the inconvenience. But if one is innocent, then ending up in jail scarcely seems to be one's own fault, and why should she apologize for the mistakes of the Commonwealth's attorney? There was probably some appropriate passage in the Scriptures about it, but she wasn't yet bored enough to search for it. People seemed to think she should spend her every waking hour poring over the good book, seeking forgiveness, or praying for deliverance from her oppressors. But to do so would be to spend every waking moment dwelling on her present situation, and that she could not bear. She couldn't see any point in dreading the future until you knew what it was. What she craved was distraction. If she could not leave her jail cell bodily, at least she could go elsewhere in her mind. In The Devil Amongst the Lawyers, Nora Bonesteel is a 12-year-old girl just coming to terms with her gift of the sight, the ability to know things that other people don't know. In this scene, her teacher is thinking about what an unusual student Nora is. Nora's desk was next to the window, and if you asked Miss Parsons, the girl spent far too much time staring out at the folds of hills and entirely too little time on her sums and her spelling exercises. But one could hardly complain about the behavior of a straight-A student, although she did suspect that the girl's excellent grades came not from any particular interest in the subjects, nor even in a desire to please her teacher, but simply because it came easily to her. Sometimes she had strange views on the lessons, though, especially in American history. Miss Parsons thought of the time she was describing an Indian village for the class, depicting it as she had seen one pictured in a book once. As she warmed to her theme, describing buffalo hide teepees and stern warriors with braided hair, Nora looked up from her notes and said quietly, "It wasn't like that." Miss Parsons stared. Nora seldom spoke in class unless she was called on. "I beg your pardon?" "They didn't live in teepees around here. They used river cane mixed with something that looked like plaster, and their huts had thatched roofs like you see in those pictures of English cottages. And the men didn't wear braids. Their heads were shaved, except for a top knot piece. Looks to me like a rooster's comb." She proceeded to describe a Cherokee village as clearly as anyone might talk about their own community. She talked about the women making root baskets or cooking dinner of soup and cornbread on stone hearths. The children were nearby, playing with a pet dog. After a couple of minutes, Nora stopped abruptly. She blushed and stammered and had looked down at her desk. The other children had been staring at her in bewilderment. Now a few of them started to snicker. "Well, Nora, you certainly have a lively imagination," Miss Parsons had said. And Nora nodded, still not looking up. But in later lessons, when she had urged Nora to use her imagination to talk about Versailles or the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock, Nora didn't seem to know any more about them than the other students. Decidedly, she was a strange girl. In this scene, 12-year-old Nora Bonesteel, who has the gift of the sight, has been taken to Pound, Virginia, the little village in which the murder of Pollock Morton occurred. Her cousin Carl, who is a reporter covering the trial, is hoping that with Nora's gift of the sight, she can tell him something about the crime that nobody else would know. Nora, whose day had started before sunup, had been dozing, but she opened her eyes and looked out at the jumble of shops and houses straddling the riverbank between two high wooded ridges. "It's just a place," she thought. It didn't seem any different from the little communities that dotted the hills back home, and she didn't suppose the people would be much different either. Carl had come around and opened the door for her, so she stepped out into the wide main road and looked around. "Do you see anything?" She pointed. "There's a black and white cat just went under the steps over there." They looked at each other and laughed. Carl shook his head ruefully. "So, no headless horsemen or spooks in sheets parading up and down Main Street?" She laughed. "Nary one, Carl." "Well, as long as you're here, I might as well give you the 10-cent tour." He steered her gently to the sidewalk in front of a shabby one-story building. "That house there is the Mortons' place. In there is where Irma's father died." He said it offhandedly, but he was watching her carefully for a reaction. She looked at the dingy little building and the leaf-swept yard. "I wish I could help you, Carl." "I must have sounded awful selfish about this, Nora. I'm trying to strike that delicate balance between ruthless and no account. And I'm new at it, so sometimes I may put a foot wrong. But what matters more to me is the truth. If that young woman is being hounded for something she did not do, I'd like to set things straight if I could. I know this case is already bringing trouble to the community with all those backwoods stories the big city dailies are running. It would be worse if this was all done at the expense of justice." "I thought the famous reporters were all taking her side." "Well, they are, but they seem to think that the only way they can see to help her is to make everybody else in the country look bad. Or maybe they're not even trying to help at all. Maybe they just flipped a coin, picked a side, and started slinging mud to liven things up." Nora shivered a little in the cold sunshine as a gust of wind found the passage between the hills. She wanted to leave. All she felt from the house and its surroundings was a tightening in her throat and the weight of misery, such as anybody might have felt knowing what had happened in that place. "It doesn't happen very often," she said at last. "Sometimes I'll get a touch of something that belonged to a person, and I'll get a flash of a vision, or maybe I'll see things that other folks don't, but I can't make it happen, Carl. Mostly I just wish it wouldn't happen at all. But these folks are nothing to do with me. I'm sorry for their troubles, and I hope justice is done, but I can't say what that would be." "Let's go on back then," said Carl. "I just wish I knew for sure, that's all." As they started back to the car, a little girl in a red coat came running around the side of the house and nearly collided with Nora. She shook the white blonde curls out of her eyes and peered up at the unexpected obstacle. "You ain't seen my kitty." Nora, who was only 12 herself, never saw any reason to treat children like adorable little pets, and she never would. "Was your cat a white one with black spots?" "Yes." "Well, he's over yonder under the steps of that house. Do you need help to catch him?" Carl glanced over at the post office. "Don't be long, Nora. I'm just going to run over there and buy some stamps in case they want me to mail a story back to Johnson City instead of phoning it in to a rewrite man." He hurried away, and Nora and the girl in the red coat walked toward the house with the wooden steps and a crawl space underneath. "You seen my spotted cat?" the girl asked. "Just a minute ago," said Nora. "I miss him." "Did he run away then?" "No, he got runned over last summer. I got me a yeller cat now, but Spot was better. I still see him sometimes." She looked up at Nora with a wide-eyed expression that grown-ups would mistake for innocence. "You seen him, too?" "Yes." "You see other stuff?" "Yes." "I got me an Indian chum down by the river now and again." Nora nodded. "I see them, too, sometimes up home." "You get scared of 'em?" Nora considered it. "Not any longer. I guess they scared me when I was little, but they can't hurt you. Mostly they're sad. Tell me what else you see." The little girl narrowed her eyes. She looked up at Nora with a shrewd expression that belied her blonde innocence. "You're wanting me to tell you about Mr. Morton what's dead, ain't you?" Nora took a deep breath. "You've seen him, haven't you?" "Just the one time, since." "Yes, since he died. Did you speak to him?" The child shrugged. "He was down by the river, and I was looking for my kitty. I wouldn't have gone near him, 'cept he seemed right happy. More so than he had been when he was living, I reckon." "Did he say anything to you about how he died?" "I didn't care about that. 'Tain't our business. But he's glad. He said he'd been wanting a long time to go over the river and get shut of his family, and now he could. Said he's right glad to go. And I stood there and watched him walk right across the top of the water and into the sunshine and gone. Ain't seen him since."
Sharyn McCrumb's latest ballad novel is The Devil Amongst the Lawyers, which you can find online at us.macmillan.com/The Devil Amongst the Lawyers.